So I did have a picture of my dog here because I figured you could see me, so you didn't need a photo of me. But it didn't configure properly with the PowerPoint, so it's a sort of boring slide. But basically, my bio said, I grew up in Dandenong Ranges, and I became active in the climate change space in university when I was studying the politics surrounding the clean energy reform, and saw it come in and be promptly taken out by the Abbott government, and just felt incredibly scared about the impacts of climate change, and also incredibly frustrated by our government's inaction on it, and that propelled me into action, and I've been working on that ever since. But at the moment, working with GetUp, I have the opportunity to work on other campaigns. At the moment, I'm working on marriage equality, which is good and good fun. So that's a little bit about me. Could people raise their hands in the room if you've heard of GetUp, the organisation? Yeah, cool. So a lot of people have, which is great. So up there is just a quote from one of our core volunteers. GetUp is a grassroots organising, people-powered movement, a sophisticated election-winning machine, a powerful campaigning community, and a bunch of lovely, very dedicated people, which we thought was a great quote. So GetUp was founded in 2005 in the John Howard era, and the idea behind it was that we needed an organisation that wasn't just working on one issue, but that was working on a range of issues that are connected and that are pushing for a progressive Australia in the face of a lot of not so progressive policies under Howard. Since then, we've been around for about 12 years now, and lots of successes and failures along the way. We've got a mailing list of 1.1 million people, which is pretty big in the NGO sector in Australia, and that's sort of a lot of what our focus has been on building our online community, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we're multi-issue, and I'll explain more about the issues that we work on at the moment, but probably a lot of you are familiar with them, and they go right from sort of environmental issues through to human rights and stuff around economic fairness. We're non-party aligned, and that's a big part of our identity is to not be aligned to political parties. And we're also very focused on national issues, so issues of national significance rather than more local issues. We're reactive and nimble. That's a big part of our sort of organisational DNA. So we tend to sort of jump on and do things when they come up and they're really important. And a really big part of what GetUp does as well is to use cutting-edge technology, and that's part of what's set us apart over the years from some other similar sort of NGOs working in the space. So I won't read through all of those. You can have a squiz, but the sort of values and the world that we're striving to see is, a fair Australia, a just Australia, a flourishing Australia, and that's relating to environment, and also we're striving for a thriving democracy. So they're sort of our guiding values and the world that we're trying to see through our work. What this manifests in is 3 campaign pillars. So we have human rights, which has mainly been work on asylum seekers and refugees, and will continue to be so for some time, unfortunately, I think. And then economic fairness, which covers a lot of different sort of areas, but it's essentially about trying to maintain and build our social security net and our public institutions. So some of the big things that GetUp has worked on in this area have been around protecting the ABC, for example, protecting Medicare, and at the moment trying to stop drug testing for welfare recipients. And then environmental justice, which is climate change mainly for GetUp at the moment, for the same reason that refugees are the main thing under human rights, because these are really intractable problems that have huge national significance and that keep sticking around and that we keep needing to work on. And so I suppose our role is trying to build an active civil society and trying to win change on issues that feel intractable and that are very hard politically. And that's sort of the space that we occupy. So I've got just a couple of our achievements up there, and I'm sure there's heaps more, and I'm very new to the organisation, but these were some that I read when I did some research. So we've been successful in winning funding for mental health, and also restoring funding to ARENA, which is one of our renewable energy funding organisations, and more recently worked on the Let Them Stay campaign quite intensively, and helped with a bunch of other organisations help stop the deportation of 300 asylum seekers back to Manus Island and Nauru. Some of you probably saw the occupation of the Lady Cilantro Hospital to try and stop baby Asha being taken away. So GetUp was involved with that with a bunch of other great organisations, and yeah, it was a very powerful campaign. And then that one down the bottom is actually quite an early one, winning a court challenge to place an extra 100,000 people on the electoral roll. Oh yeah, it's very stuck down the bottom, sorry about that. So I suppose GetUp's traditional approach, so the approach that we've taken for pretty much all of our existence, has been very focused on online or digital campaigning. So a lot of online petitioning, online letters, a lot of people taking action online. We've also had a lot of media, and that's been a core part of our strategy, has been media work, lobbying, and I actually and paid advertising as well, so sort of targeted advertising in MP seats and things like that. And I didn't put it up here, but legal strategies as well. We've funded a lot of legal battles, and we continue to do that. But at the moment, the organisation is going through a really huge organisational shift, and that's sort of what I'm a really big part of and what I'll be mainly talking about today, which is that we are trying to still do stuff online and still do all of this stuff, but do a lot more offline, so face-to-face, and move to a community organising approach, which is most similar to public participation, I suppose, than what we've previously done. And I suppose, suffice to say, this is a really huge shift for GetUp, and it will take a few years. And I'm right in the eye of the storm at the moment, and it's a frightening place to be. I suppose what guides us in this work is the practice of community organising, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And in trying to pin down and define community organising can actually be quite hard, is what I realised over time. But I've tried to talk a little bit about it in this presentation. So the idea behind community organising is that basically it's about bringing people together around shared interests and shared values to work to achieve outcomes that will have an impact on their lives. So up here I've written, community organising builds power through gathering people with shared interests to take collective action. So it's about building power through community, and it's about shifting power relationships and putting more power in community and with people, with everyday people. That's sort of the essence of it. I'm sorry, I converted this to a different type of PowerPoint, and some stuff's right at the bottom, but didn't miss too much. So these are some characteristics of community organising. So strategy is at the core of it. If we don't have a strategy, then it's hard to do good organising. So this is the idea that we have, a series of steps that we think will get us to where we want to be. And that often it involves direct communication, so there's a big focus on people-to-people direct communication through one-on-one conversations and that kind of thing. And a lot of the time it's about listening to people, hearing what their concerns are and what their values are and what drives them, and using that to inform our campaigning and to get people involved. Recruitment is sort of core to it as well. It's about building the number of people taking action, and being part of that movement and that community. And sort of inherent to that, there's training and development and leadership development that allows people to, take effective action. So does that sort of make sense to folks in terms of community organising and what that looks like a little bit? Yeah. I'm not sure if it, yeah. At GetUp, the way that we're trying to achieve this is through setting up local action groups. So this is a really old idea. This is nothing new. Organisations have been setting up local chapters, or they're often called chapters or local action groups for years. And so we're now doing that as well. And the plan is to initially start with 45 action groups. I think we've got 42 at the moment. And by the end of 2020, have 150 local action groups around Australia. They'll be based around federal electorates because we're sort of broadly a federally based national organisation. We actually just launched this GetUp Action Network in proper in September at an event called Power Up, which was our first ever member conference. And so that's just happened, and we've got a lot of new local groups trying to work out how the hell they are part of this, what they do as part of this GetUp Action Network and how they fit in. And we're, defining that as we go. So the idea is that local GetUp action groups will be driving GetUp campaigns on the ground and continuing that work between campaigns. So previously we've had people jumping in and taking online action on a particular campaign and then maybe jumping out. The idea is that these groups continue to work on GetUp's campaigns and drive them and improve them and roll them out with lots of face-to-face action. I guess what's really particular to GetUp, or more particular to GetUp, is that we have a big focus on conversations, but particularly through phone calls. So we've been working with this really awesome technology, which essentially allows people to talk with anyone in Australia about particular issues. So I've got an example later that should make it a bit more real. But essentially, this is the equivalent of door knocking, but you don't need to be in that town at that time. You can call, people in that particular electorate or that particular place because that's what's needed and that's who we need to talk to at that point in time. So it sort of allows us to work on national campaigns regardless of where people are based. So I guess the really interesting part, I had a picture there as well, which is not, that's okay. I guess the really interesting part of this is actually setting up the groups, getting groups of people to work together around some kind of shared goal, and I think everybody has experience of this in some ways, and perhaps you guys have a lot of experience in that can be challenging. And so we're setting that up at the moment, and some of the approaches that we've had to that, or some of the things that we've done to try and get the network off the ground. So initially it's just laying out the network principles. So what does it mean to be part of the GetUp Action Network? And this is sort of encoding what we might call our DNA into the groups. That we work on national issues is sort of the big one. Another one is that our groups have structure, they have roles that we use. I should be able to remember them all off the top of my head, there's about 10. But they're the principles that guide our work and that make us a network rather than just a bunch of disparate groups. So laying out those network principles, establishing how we communicate is really important. So we're using Slack, which probably lots of people use, but this big online communications tool which allows the whole network to chat and have their own groups, but then come together around sort of network communication. And there's other ways, but that's one of the ways. And then setting up good cultures in the group, and this is the harder part, I think, in many ways. And a lot of the work, this is where our real sort of facilitation and support comes in, where we're trying to support groups to set up things like participants agreements and establish their mission, establish how they're going to communicate, establish their norms, and that's and sort of supporting them to hold their first meetings and their second meetings and establish the way that they operate together as a group in a way that is welcoming and welcomes diversity and has all of those values sort of ensured. So that's a lot of what we've been doing over the past few weeks. So I'm just going to wrap up with an example of how we've been campaigning over the past 6 months, just to make it a little bit less abstract, I suppose. So a big thing I've been working on is the Stop Adani campaign. Have most people heard of the Stop Adani campaign? Raise your hand if you have, yeah. So a few people, not everyone, but probably most people have heard of Adani at least. And so it would be one of the biggest coal mines in the world that it's built. And there's a lot of groups and organisations working to try and stop the mine from going ahead. And a big part of what GetUp has been doing as part of that is to essentially to try and get particular politicians to come out against the mine by talking to people in by talking to their constituents, I should say, through the phone calling technology that I mentioned earlier. The strategy has changed over time, but essentially we started out making phone calls to the constituents of Liberal backbenchers who are moderate and who are more likely to come out against the loan. And so that's where we started, and we had 2 Liberal backbenchers come out against the Adani mine after we spoke with hundreds of their constituents. And basically it just involved people getting on the phones and having a conversation and gauging whether the people they were speaking to supported the mine or not, and then letting the politician know that we were speaking to their constituents about this issue and letting them know the levels of opposition to the mine in their electorate. Over time, the strategy shifted a bit, and we had a sort of crazy two-week period where we were focusing on the Queensland state government because they were organising a royalties deal with Adani, basically to allow them not to pay royalties for a period of time. And so we called into the seats of cabinet ministers in Queensland and basically caused ruptures within the party and had the deputy premier come out and say that they wouldn't give Adani a royalties deal, and then the treasurer come out and say that they would, and a whole bunch of quite stressful and unpredictable stuff happened. And it was really just largely because we got on the phones to people, talk to their constituents, and then let them know about it. And that's we spent about 4 months working on that. And that's just an example of one of the ways that GetUp does campaigning. So I think that's all I've got time for. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Vicky. Just hold your questions, write them down, and we'll hear from Cam and then do some conversations.
Thanks, Jason. Do I need this? Is it okay if I just project up the back? Okay, if I'm going too quiet, just let me know. So thanks for the chance to have a chat today. I wanted to do 3 things. Just very quickly talk a little bit around the strategic approach we take to building engagement. I wanted to walk you through 2 campaigns that we've been working on recently, and as fellow practitioners, I just wanted to share the things we've learned. We've just done some really substantial evaluation of a 5-year and a 6-year campaign around community organising. We're finding there's just a lot of common learned experiences that we are taking back away from that. So very quickly, in terms of where we're coming from, we're quite an unusual group in that there's often what are called the big 3 NGOs, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Greenpeace International, Friends of the Earth International. Our model is quite unusual in that it's not a top-down organisation, it's a confederation of independent groups who collaborate. Because we're in 77 countries, we have a one country, one vote model in effect, and more than half of our members are from the Global South. So what that means, in our structure, we have a regional structure, so Australia's part of Asia Pacific, we've got Africa, we've got the Americas, we've got Europe. Basically, the voices from the South, from what we used to call the Third World, are quite dominant in our network. And so what that means is we're seeking to embrace a form of environmentalism that is predicated on human rights, access to resources and access to the things we all need to have a life of dignity. So it quite changes the approach from being, if you like, a traditional greenie organisation that is primarily focused about biodiversity. And the model, the most basic model we use is that we find and develop what we call strategic alliances with allies. We have tactical alliances that are short term, perhaps around specific campaign, but we have major long-term strategic alliances, and the strongest one we have is actually with La Via Campesina, which is the Peasants Farmers Network, which represents tens of millions of small-scale subsistence farmers around the world. So that influences what we do. Back here in Australia, we consider ourselves a grassroots empowerment network. So that's the approach we take. We don't see ourselves as being a traditional lobbying organisation, but we're very similar to the other large groups, Wilderness Society or ACF or whatever, in that we're membership-based and we do all the traditional media, research, lobbying and all the rest of it. And we have a belief that democracy is better where citizens feel empowered and communities are powerfully engaged in taking decisions. And I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Rebecca Solnit. Do most people know her? Solnit. If you don't know her, I highly recommend her. There's a book in particular. She's an author and an activist who lives in California, written some pretty scathing stuff analysing the Trump phenomenon. But she wrote a fantastic book called A Paradise Built in Hell. And what she did was she looked at disasters like Hurricane Katrina, and she looked at how communities responded after disasters. She went back, I think, as far as the 1905 or 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and she just looked at how communities responded, and she found that communities that had high level of engagement and high levels of volunteerism and high levels of local organisation, surprise, surprise, did very well when the federal government structures suddenly were no longer available because of a fire or an earthquake or anything. And that's really influenced the way we work. And we feel that government decisions and corporate decisions will be better when communities are mobilised, because otherwise we are, as individuals, we're very beholden to the structures we find ourselves in. And of course, we live in a time of atomisation. We have this divergence that's going on in our communities, and we feel that engagement in civil society actually reduces the sense of atomisation and individualisation which is occurring in the consumer societies. We've just finished 2 campaigns. About 6 or 7 years ago, we basically withdrew our resources out of the national realm and we focused on the state levels, and we've been concentrating there because we feel that in the current climate you get much better value for money in terms of getting outcomes for the human resources that you put into campaigns. We ran a successful campaign to get a ban on fracking, the process of hydraulic fracturing, which is a form of drilling for gas, which is very destructive. We ran a campaign here and we got the first permanent ban on fracking in Australia, and that has led to impacts all around the world. Just recently Ireland has followed Victoria's example, and the Victorian campaign really influenced them. We also got a campaign for the Victorian government to put in place a thing called the VRED, a Victorian Renewable Energy Target, and that was basically because we were able to convince them to act because of the lack of action and leadership that was going on federally. So those 2 campaigns were predicated on working with communities to empower them, to engage them, to use frames and to find common cause that would allow us to work with them. So they were not more along the lines of the traditional environmental campaigning. Another name, George Lakoff, I assume most people are familiar with his work. His famous book, Don't Think of an Elephant, I think it's called, where he talks about this concept of framing. What is the frame that you use in order to engage people? And his critique of people like me and groups like mine is that we go, climate change is terrible and here are the facts and figures and you must believe me. Whereas conservatives have been much better at talking about narratives and talking about values, talking about community, talking about matters of the heart. And so his kind of learning to us, I guess, is speak from the heart and tell good stories and stop, ramming facts and figures down people's throats. So that's kind of the model that we sought to use. The gas ban campaign, I think, was really important because we learnt on the job, and we did 3 things. The first one was there was a film called Gaslands, which was about a guy who travelled around the United States and looked at the impact of fracking. Lots of people saw that and got quite upset in Victoria, so we basically put the issue on the map of a lot of people, and we did CSG roadshows, and we went out and we explained to farmers about how bad this fracking would be for their communities. That mobilised people. But it kind of set ourselves up for defeat, because the next stage in the campaign was to say, over here in Western Victoria or over here in Gippsland, there's a proposal to allow exploration for coal seam gas or shale gas or tight gas or whatever it might have been. We think what you should do is mobilise against that and write to the government and engage in the submission process. And of course, in every single case we lost because the system was set up to approve mining approvals for these companies. There'd never been one that had been knocked back in the state of Victoria. So what we did in effect was raise people's expectations, raise their hope they could have an impact, and then we were all just kind of smashed flat by the fact that, you know, we weren't getting anywhere with it. And it kind of deepened that cynicism that people had towards getting involved, which is a real problem in Australia. You know, we tend to think that corporations will have their way and governments will do what they're going to do anyway, and why should I bother? You know, that is quite deeply ingrained. So the third model, so from putting it on the map, follow the licenses, the third stage was to build community power. And we started to work with a pretty amazing woman from northern New South Wales called Annie Keir. She developed a thing called the gas fuel free organising model in conjunction with other people up there. And it was based on a really simple premise that if we as a community, and we're living in Lee and Gaffer, say in Gippsland, and there's a proposal for coal seam gas mining in our community, and if we get together, how do we demonstrate our power? And so we said, well, one way of doing that is for us as a representative group of that community is to get ourselves organised, go out and door knock our community and poll them and actually find out if they want this drilling to proceed. So that's what we did. In the end, we had 75 communities across regional Victoria door knock their entire community around a simple question: would you support this industry becoming established or would you oppose it? We had an average level of support to oppose it of around 94%. The lowest we ever got was in Ballara in Gippsland, where a whole bunch of coal miners live there, and in spite of that there was an 88% support for basically opposing it. And what that community would then do would be to declare itself gas field free. The first one was a human sign on a beach down in Gippsland. But the beauty of it was each community did something that represented them. So there were signs with utes, there were signs with hay, there were signs with sheep, you know, there was just whatever made sense for you. Ballara, they had a folk festival because that's what they do down there apparently, you know. So it was a kind of manifestation of the spirit of that community. And it was beautiful because it used this lake-off narrative, which was, our understanding was always, in an issue, you get a series of threads. And our approach was you don't have to agree to all the threads, but all the threads together make a rope. You can break a thread really easily. It's very hard to break a rope. So we would say, if you're concerned about impacts on groundwater, then you're part of this campaign. If you're concerned about climate change, then you're part of this campaign. You can be a climate denier, but be worried about groundwater. If you're a farmer and you're worried about economics, then you should be here. If you're just a parent worried about the gas trucks going past your kid's school, you need to be here. If you're concerned around tourism or the clean and green image of your community, or you know how your local government's going to be impacted if you start to lose ratepayers, you need to be here. And what that meant was there was no political debate around we all have to believe in climate change, or we all have to be farmers, or we all have to support tourism. If you believe in one, then there's a place for you here. So it was a really beautifully low ideologically form of kind of community organising that was predicated on finding common cause and moving up. First couple of declarations were completely ignored by the media and certainly by all politicians. And I remember it grew and it grew and it grew. So this is from 2011 until 2014. There was a point where at Mauriac, if you know, just to the west of Geelong, there was a declaration and there was an election on the horizon, a state election, and I kid you not, at that point, politicians and candidates were almost like pushing each other out of the way to get in the photo at the end. Like, you know, it just built power. The Age never really ran a story on this. The Herald Sun certainly didn't run a story. The mainstream media ignored it because nothing was going on out there. The Weekly Times, which is the regional press, followed it all the time. They were amazing because they got that something was going on. They said that in the state election in 2014, it was the second most important issue after TAFE closures in Victoria, and it basically pushed, you know, people. It pushed the Farmers Federation, it pushed the coalition, which provided the opportunity for the ALP to go, we'll get ahead of them, and provided opportunity for the Greens. And as a result of the ALP coming to power, we had a state inquiry, we got this permanent ban, and we also got an ongoing moratorium on what they call conventional gas drilling in the state. So that's just a very kind of brief summary of what the campaign was, and I want to just finish by talking about the things we learned, because I think I could also tell you the same story, say, with the North-South pipeline campaign we ran, or the VREC campaign. But these were the things that really jumped out at us. The first thing was it was effective because it wasn't either-or campaigning. It wasn't based on lobbying, and it wasn't just based on community power. It was based on doing both, so what we call inside track and outside track campaigning. And the reason it worked, what often happens is professionals who tend to lobby and know government processes and talk to ministers, advisors, aren't the people at the grassroots. And the people at the grassroots tend to think, oh, those people are just, wasting time and think they're really important, but that's not where the power is. Our job was to build trust between the grassroots, so when the inside track people got good intelligence about this minister was wavering or this candidate was keen, they could mobilise the grassroots very quickly. And to my mind, that's the best form of campaigning we have at present, one that really is integrated. I mentioned before about this notion of the threads, that it was a values-based campaign and it was about learning to speak from the heart and finding common cause. Some of these sound like truisms and cliches, but they are actually true. One is trust matters and relationship matters, and you need to actually front-load campaigns and spend a lot of time drinking tea and sitting around tables and chatting to people. You can't KPI that, it's not about metrics. I guess you could do how many cups of tea did you drink, but it's groups like us, we love our metrics, whereas what works is actually just going out and meeting people where they are, building trust, building understanding, working from the ground up, and being very upfront and very honest. So we have what we call radical transparency. Of course, we're a group concerned about climate change. We want 100% renewables. Here's who funds us. Here's who we're answerable to. We're not here to ram that down your throat. We're here to find common cause with you. But when asked, we would be very transparent about who and what we were and how we're working. That tends to break down cynicism, because people coming from the outside always triggers a cynical response. We also understood that the benefits of the campaign went well beyond the outcome, and by what that is, you started to mobilise people across an entire community. And what we heard thousands of times was, I've seen you down the street for years but I've never said hello, or, oh, I think my son plays cricket with you. That sense of building community was unbelievably powerful. The thing that was necessary to make it work was to do a skills audit of each group, of those 75 groups as they were established. The first thing was to provide training in consensus and facilitation, because there's nothing that will kill a group faster than bad decision making and terrible meetings. We learnt that out very early on. So training up the group, doing a needs assessment, you've got a journalist, you've got a trade union organiser, you've got a teacher, you've got a great website designer. So what other skills do we need in this group? And if you are the website designer, can you run a training session? You work at a community radio station, can you show us how to talk to the media? So identify the skills in the group, snowball those skills, but also identify the gaps and make sure that that there are really good skills there. In trying to believe that democracy matters more than issues, so we always try to enshrine this notion that there'll always be a point in a campaign where there's flaming disagreement, and we need to remember that no single decision is more important than the outcome of the campaign. So getting people to think beyond their entrenched position and able to think bigger was really, really important. And our motto was always look up. This isn't about being a NIMBY campaign. This is about looking up to the systemic problems that we face. And as we start to do that, we realise that people next to us might need our help. So it's based on building this kind of regional solidarity that looked up, and that was also very powerful. So in a very real sense, if there was a threat to sea spray, there was a threat to Longford. The Longford people would go and back up the sea spray people. They're the main things. The trust that I mentioned before was very important between the inside track and the outside track. But primarily, it's about two final things. One is this notion of unbranded campaigning, which is really hard for groups. We rely on members and supporters and people knowing what we do. If we're doing unbranded work, it's hard to then go, oh, we got the ban on fracking, because what has happened is it's actually the community that has done that. We've just helped facilitate it. But the other thing, and the thing that really I have found unbelievably hopeful as someone that's been, a campaigner for a long time, is to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Victorian people for the first time in their lives decide that they're drawing a line in the sand in their life and they're no longer going to be an innocent bystander. And to see that happen and to see how a year on from this campaign winning, where all those people are now and how active they are and the amazing work that they're doing, I really honestly think we've helped build a movement. And it just heartens me in a way that's very hard to describe, to see the transformation of those people. So I hope that has been of some use to you. I haven't just been ranting at you, but thanks for having a listen.
Nice presentation. Well, I'm sure that you found that as interesting as I did. We'll take some questions shortly. Questions to the audience. Does anyone have an iPhone charger? Otherwise, I'm going to read out a couple of these questions really quickly before I lose my battery. Now, any questions that aren't answered will be emailed to Cam and to Vicky, and that they will respond to them. But here we go. Right. How does GetUp balance a campaign that has impacts both good and bad for social, economic and environmental elements? Do you pick one element and focus on that, or do you represent it all?
Great question. I suppose the question is a little bit about how we pick campaigns, but then also how we frame them and what we focus on. That's my understanding of the question. So in terms of the first part, we pick campaigns. There's a bunch of criteria that we use around, winnability. How iconic is it? Does it fit does it play to our strengths? All that kind of stuff. In terms of the issue and how we frame it, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought of that before. Does the questioner have an example of an issue? So I suppose climate change, for example, is a human rights issue as well as an environmental issue. And I suppose, it's your question. Great. So I suppose we probably just look at what would seem to be the primary area, and from there it's about, okay, well, this campaign director or this campaign team is going to work on it because it most sits with them. But that's not to say that we don't talk about human rights in our climate change campaigning, or that we don't talk about economic fairness in our when we're talking about specific campaigns. And part of what we want to do at GetUp is to reduce the issue silo, and that's part of our strength in working on multiple issues, is that we're across them and we can do that. So we do try and sort of mix it up in that way and make sure that the issues aren't sort of solely focused on environmental outcomes, for example. And GetUp also doesn't have a history of doing that, so a lot of environmental organisations will have had a strong history of focusing a lot on environmental outcomes almost exclusively. But I suppose because we've always been multi-issue, that hasn't tended to be the way we frame things. So I'm sure there's been exceptions over the years, but yeah.
Thank you.
I hope that makes sense.
Okay, that's great. How about a question from anyone in the room? Otherwise I'll go to my other questions here. Someone have a question for either Cam or Vicky? Do you want to?
As engagement practitioners, we often work on issues that aren't very popular with the community. So on the CSG issue, given what you know about those communities, do you think it would have been possible for the proponents of that industry to have engaged in a way that might have garnered community support or acceptance for that industry?
Absolutely, and they were in some ways our best allies because they did it so badly. And they actually made for really good villains in the narrative. A couple of the operators did really well, and ExxonMobil is the standout. They did very good community engagement early on, where they did go out and they sought to really engage well with the community. And, they would have been very hard to deal with, being very frank, and thankfully they withdrew from the onshore conventional gas industry in the process of the campaign, leaving the cowboys. And the cowboys made great villains, and they were very ham-fisted in everything. To a degree, the reason we got the ban was because the industry it's almost like it went out of its way to alienate the community by saying they were done.
I have another question over here.
Do you rank liking a Facebook page as an action or a measurable activity?
I can speak to that. Might copy it down and stand up because it's definitely nicer. Sorry, are you able to repeat the question?
Yeah, do you actually rank or
Yep.
use liking a Facebook page as an activity that counts towards a campaign or action?
Right. Count towards in terms of our sort of KPIs or
Yeah, or any kind of measure. So I'm pretty actively involved in a lot of these
Yep.
things online.
Yep.
I don't do Facebook, I sign petitions and other things.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of environmental activism predominantly, counting numbers around Facebook pages and, just to be a box, to me as an engagement practitioner or behaviour change person, doesn't really make a difference.
Yeah, so I suppose I think if you're talking about any particular tactic within a campaign, it's difficult to sort of say this works or this doesn't work because different tactics in different settings will work differently. Sorry, that sounds obvious, but if you're in a community where it's a small community and not many people use Facebook and suddenly a Facebook page becomes incredibly active and there's a lot of people on it, maybe in that case that actually would be quite a valuable tool. But certainly a lot of the time it's easy to see that it wouldn't be valuable because it's oversaturated. So always hesitant to sort of say this particular tactic is or is not effective because it's very contextual. And what will be effective is very contextual. But in terms of, at least for GetUp, because we've done so much online campaigning and that's been such a big way that we've engaged people, over the years what we've come to is that it doesn't cut it. It doesn't equal really transformative engagement for people, and it doesn't work for them at a personal level, and it doesn't work as well in a campaign setting, and that's why we're moving to a model that seeks to get people out doing stuff physically, and that's what you need, I think. So sort of moving to that, but perhaps in the past, and perhaps certain parts of GetUp still have a big focus on that sort of more online stuff. Yeah, don't know if Jan, you wanted to add to that? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Okay, I'll go to one back on the bot here. I guess it refers to the first question, but it's slightly different. How do you decide to take on an issue? Is there a board that reviews submissions and issues?
Was this specific?
Yes, it was,
Specific
yeah.
figure?
Yeah.
Okay. So, great question. So as I mentioned, in terms of how we pick our campaigns, there is a sort of a series of criteria. I haven't been actually that involved in that, so I'm not really an expert on it. But it partly has to do with GetUp. It partly has to do with the issue and its importance, and it partly has to do with our sort of what we usually work on, what is our area of expertise and strength. In terms of the sort of governance around campaigns, which seemed to be what the question was relating to, we have a board and we have an executive team, and we're GetUp at least, it's sort of differently to FO, is set up pretty similarly to other organisations, in that we've got a hierarchical model, we've got an executive director, we've got a chief of staff and that kind of stuff. And the decision making sits with, at the same time we do have quite a lot of sort of autonomy within the campaigns team. So our campaigns teams, and we've got 3, so I mentioned them before, human rights, economic fairness and environmental justice. They do a lot of the decision making, but then the executive team will be involved on some level, and ultimately the board as well. Hope that answers that question.
Do you have a view on that, Ken?
It's terrible because it's only a military analogy, sorry about this, but we often think in terms of there's the air war, the ground war, the air war being the groups that have lots of resources that can impact across the whole field, mainstream media, really heavy duty lobbying. The ground war, of course, is the large numbers of people, troops out in the field, door knocking, canvassing, doing that type of face-to-face work. And then there's the notion of the guerrilla war, which is the small light units that are very resource light, that can move quickly, be nimble, seize opportunities. And that's the position we see ourselves as being in. So we think that in taking decisions, you've always got to look at the big picture. In the movement, who is doing what and where are the gaps? And our job, as we see it, is to strategically fill the gaps where the other large groups aren't currently active.
Okay, good. Look, you might have been standing up. Next question's for you. You spoke of a narrative, storytelling versus facts. How do you reconcile the facts of an issue with an ideological objective? That's a really good question, because just because people are telling a story doesn't mean they're right, and we come up with that with climate change a lot. We just seek to pick frames that are kind of, you know, straightforward and stand up to a robust assessment. So we would say basically things that, for instance, community is good, enhanced community is good, and anything that enhances a sense of conviviality and community and connection is inherently going to be good. So, you know, you could dismiss that as kind of, you know, parenthood statements. Our approach would be to say, well, people live in community, we are altruistic, we like to get on where we can, and so we take that as a starting point. And then once you know people, it's easier to argue the facts of the matter with them. So the climate contrarian, denier, you know, climate science debate, we often have a year into working with the community. We say it'll just cause problems if we start too early, let's wait a while and then wait until people start to raise it with us. And you've just got to be prepared. Once you trust people, you know, on social media it's easy to flame people you don't know and tell them they're idiots. You can do it to people you barely know, face to face, but once you know people, once you've worked with them, it's very hard to tell them they're just idiots and don't know what they're talking about. So it takes that conversation around facts to a really more nuanced place. And so we quite consciously identify early the tricky issues in that community and then try and hold them off and say, let's just concentrate on what we agree on for now and wait for people to come to us and start to, you know, once we know them and once we trust each other and once we actually care about what each other thinks, and then have that conversation from there. Great, thank you. So there's a question for both of you. You both work in areas where you will often go into a community and sometimes there are polarising views within a community, and we've all seen what can happen in communities when one side is against the other. How do you negotiate and navigate your way through that as representatives of your organisation? What strategies do you have around that?
We think a lot about frames. So to give you one example, the VREP campaign, the Renewable Energy Campaign, you could go in there and say, we need renewables because of climate change and to protect the environment, which is guaranteed to polarise a regional community. So instead we thought about it and thought the frames that actually work here is job creation, regional development, drought-proof income for farmers from hosting turbines, and rates payments to local councils which will benefit those local communities. So our approach has been to find frames where there is broad common agreement and work from there, and consciously leave out the things that we know are inherently polarising.
Actually, I haven't done a whole lot of that going into community kind of work. I've generally been city-based, and that hasn't been a big thing. So I'm not going to blag and pretend I could answer all of that, so I just won't.
Okay, I'm happy to take some other questions from the floor rather than keep looking down on the phone. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to pose based on what you've heard so far? Great.
Yeah, I'm interested in, I'm not quite sure how to frame the question. A lot of what we do with community and stakeholder engagement is the responsibility to make sure people are really well informed before they get into that sort of discussion and decision-making process. So I'm just wondering what tactics you've got for getting people to be really informed about an issue before you're getting them to take action.
So I suppose the thing that GetUp does is emails. That's sort of been really the bedrock of what we've done and how we've built our online community of supporters. And GetUp's really committed to writing emails that are actually quite long a lot of the time and quite descriptive and well researched. So we do use emails to inform people a lot. that's a big part of it. Now that we're working, I suppose, in a more intensive way, in a more ongoing way with people, there's other sort of methods that we need to take, and that's around, you know, sort of providing fact sheets, doing our background checks, and then updating, you know, keeping those fact sheets or whatever sort of tools we're utilising to inform people up to date. And other sort of tools like webinars, we use a lot to reach lots of people and inform lots of people at once. I mentioned earlier that we've got our network will be using Slack, and we have been and will be utilising that to keep people up to date with campaigns and with information as it comes in. So it's sort of just, as a campaigner, as an organiser, there's just the responsibility to keep people informed as you go along and to be as informed as you can. But generally it's our campaigns teams that are sort of very, very closely engaged in the issues and doing all that sort of fact checking and so on. I think those are the main ways I can think of. Yeah.
I'll give you 30
I think
seconds.
it sort of does relate back to the fracking issue in a way. I mean, we heard loud and clear the information coming on the reasons why not to frack. The industry seemed very poor, as you said before, about getting out information that would support it.
I think you're right, and so we had two tasks. One was to interrogate where the science was coming from and make sure that it was actually independent. But the cut-through came from peer-to-peer learning. So you're working with a dairy farmer or you're working with a sheep farmer, they're going to listen to other sheep farmers or other dairy farmers. So a big part of our work was to facilitate, say, people coming down from southwest Queensland that are living in the industry, who were farmers, who could share their experience with other farmers down here. And that was actually the really powerful stuff, was we tend to trust people who are like us, who have similar experiences, and will always be a bit dismissive of the experts. So we wanted to have the science there, but we did also want to have people who individual constituents in particular demographics could relate to.
Okay, look, time's got away from us. I'd like to thank Cam and Vicky for being here today and presenting some very useful information. So if you could...